Okay, to wrap up this chapter and wrap up the material for exam 3, I want to talk a little bit about social norms. And we've talked about social norms a bit here and there in this class so far. We haven't really given them clear definitions or distinguished between different kinds of them. So I want to take a moment just to do that now. In general, social norms are the guidelines for our behavior in a given context. It's important to note that social norms are dependent completely on the context and the group that they are part of. These social norms around working in an office are different than the social norms around working at a restaurant, for example. Clothing, speech, how you act, and that's just one random example. The social norms for different cultural contexts are different too. Different countries have different norms about what is appropriate. An example that comes to mind are the social norms around like greeting and proximity. In some countries, it is the norm to be relatively close to one another and greet each other with things like handshakes and hugs or kisses. But in other countries, it's more appropriate to keep a certain amount of social distance and do things like bowing instead. So this might sometimes, we will kind of see in hindsight, see if those cultural norms might do things like stem the spread of an illness, for example. But social norms can differ greatly between different countries, different groups of people, different social settings, and oftentimes it's not just these big settings where norms differ. It's, you have to know the norms as you navigate different situations in your day-to-day life. You might be aware of different social norms at a bar versus at a library versus at your place of work versus in a classroom, right? There are different types of behavior that are acceptable and expected in each of those different contexts. There are two types of social norms I want to distinguish between, and they sort of take the form of what is and what ought to be. So descriptive norms are what is, your perceptions of how people are actually behaving in a given situation. The other type of norm is an injunctive norm, perceptions of what behaviors are ideal or approved or disapproved of in a given situation. So there's a difference between what is, what people actually do, and what ought to be the kind of gold standard of what people actually do. So descriptive norms might be what people do, what people are supposed to do. This is the way I have it phrased here. Another way to think about this, through examples, maybe 60% of people give to charity is the descriptive norm, and that tells you something about what people actually are doing. But the injunctive norm might be that everyone should give to charity, right? So oftentimes there is a difference between what is and what ought to be. Maybe more salient in the world now. It might have been months ago when you were thinking about people washing their hands or something. 20% of people take 20 full seconds to actually wash their hands, when the injunctive norm would be everyone should take 20 seconds to wash their hands all the time. And the difference between what is and what ought to be has probably shrunk in the last few months as people are focusing more on sanitation and hand washing in the wake of the pandemic. But these things change with context, right? We're living in a different context now than we were a few months ago. So it's important to note that these things can even change within a particular culture across time. Social norms are not generally codified like laws are, even though I guess laws are in a sense laws are a codification of social norms. So I just lied. Anyway, most social norms, or a lot of the ones that we navigate through our everyday lives, are ones that we learn indirectly or kind of figure out through watching other people. There's not really like a clear idea of how long you're supposed to shake somebody's hand, or how much eye contact is too much eye contact. But people kind of figure these things out through the other cues people are giving them and what they see other people doing. This is communicated too by things like the state of different spaces in the world. That sometimes you're going to see the markers of different social norms. Like if you see a place that has a lot of litter and refuse around, then you might think that the norm in that place, maybe rightfully, is that people don't care much about cleanliness in those areas. But on the other hand, if you see a place where things are pristine, there is no trash anywhere, people are actively picking it up, and you might have a different inference about the types of places that you're in the place on the left versus the place on the right. One of them, you might infer other things even beyond what you see in that norm of littering. You might think people in that area are just less conscientious about all sorts of things, and that the place maybe even has some danger about it or something. But in the place on the right where things are clean, that might, the norms around that might give you some more confidence about being in an area like that. So oftentimes we are making inferences beyond the single norm that we're observing to other types of norms and other things about the environment that we might be in. Another example of this, people tend to notice the way things are when they enter a situation and try to leave them in that way. So a really simple example from everyday life is that people are likely to leave lights the way that they found them. So if you go into a public space or bathroom or something where the light is on, you're likely to leave that light on when you enter. But you are much more likely to turn that light off when you leave if it was off when you entered the room. So you're reading cues about how that physical space is maintained, and you are trying to leave things the way you found them because you are inferring something about the norms in that place and trying to keep your behavior consistent with what the norms are there. We also find that people are often trying to influence the behavior of others in, kind of indirect sorts of persuasion attempts by using social norms. So one example that is admittedly kind of antiquated now is from the world of infomercials, where people, are on TV trying to sell you some kind of device or a cure for something or whatever, maybe something for exercise or weight loss or just some random thing on a shopping channel. Obviously, I know these things are not as widespread as they used to be, but there still is, a large segment of the older population that still sees things like infomercials relatively regularly. But anyway, in infomercials, there is kind of a subtle tactic they use to try to get people to behave in a particular way because of how they communicate norms around ordering these products. Saying after an appeal to buy something that operators are standing by is something telling you that there are people ready for your orders, and that there are no prescriptions on when you can buy this product. There are always people available to take your orders. But an even more purposeful way of saying something like this might be suggesting, hey, operators might be busy, please call again if they are busy. Again, I know this is an old example. It's about even a phone when most people are ordering stuff like this online. But giving people the impression that, hey, sometimes our operators are so busy that you're going to have to try back, is giving people an impression of the descriptive norm, that people are buying this product to the point that they can't handle the demand all the time, and you might have to try again later. And I'm sure you could think of other examples that are maybe less old-fashioned and antiquated than the one that I have here, but people often use this tactic to make people think things are more popular or desirable than they actually are. And this just has to do with how we change the framing when we communicate things. And just another example of how the social reality that we live in is constructed by our perceptions and the perceptions of others and the way we communicate with one another. Things like scarcity and desirability are often not as much objective facts as they are reflections of the way that we are understanding what those words mean and how they relate to the reality that we're creating. Another maybe more interesting and more positive sort of area of this study is in using these social norms not to get people to buy things, but to get people to engage in environmentally conscious and conservation-oriented activities. So using towels in hotels is an example where researchers have looked at trying to get people to engage in more green behavior. So not only is this good for the environment to save water from washing towels that people are using in hotels, but it also, of course, saves hotels money. So when researchers are trying to look at how we can convince people of these things, oftentimes if you want to collect data in a real place, using like a real company or something, you need to show them that you can save them money too. So that's how studies like this get done, basically. But at big hotels, usually about a third of people reuse a towel. You know how they give you the option sort of that you can hang your towel back up and use it again, or you just leave it on the floor and they'll replace it, basically. So about a third of people are reusing at least one towel in hotels. One really interesting study from Bob Cialdini is the second author on this. He's a researcher that does a lot with persuasion. He and some colleagues did a study where they went to a local Holiday Inn. I believe he's at Arizona State, so probably somewhere around Tempe, Arizona, where they partnered with a Holiday Inn to see if they could get people to save more water and save the hotel more money. And they tried to use social norms to do that. Usually, the types of signs that are on doors and towel racks to get people to try to reuse their towels say something about the environment, because that's, seemingly a selfless and possibly effective way to get people to think about why it's important to reuse their towels. But, people are pretty selfish, and a lot of them don't care about the environment maybe as much as others would like them to, or they should. So these signs are not really that effective, maybe partly because they don't really use any social aspects to communicate why people should reuse towels. So what Goldstein, Cialdini, and Griscovicius did to try to move this around and study the influence of social norms was randomly assign people either to get this normal, environmentally cued type of sign, or one that told them that 75% of guests in that hotel reused their towels. And if people got this type of appeal that told them that most people, 3/4 of people in the hotel, were reusing their towels, it rose from around a third of people to around half. So not the biggest change in the world, but definitely a very reliable and significant difference that they were able to find. And they found that if they even tweaked something one more time, not just saying 75% of guests in the hotel, but most guests in this room that you're in, which is, kind of meaningless, right? Who cares if it's people in the hotel that you've been in or people in your specific room? It's kind of arbitrary who gets assigned those rooms, one would assume. But that additional kind of meaningless or seemingly meaningless connection to people can be really, really impactful. And we'll see this as a theme kind of come back when we talk about social identity theory and how our perceptions of groups work. But just feeling closer to those people and thinking, well, they're like me, I should do what they do, raised the rate from about a third to about 2/3 of people reusing their towels. So this is still a pretty famous and highly cited study about using social norms in a real world context to get people to change their behavior for the better. This isn't always necessarily a process that leads to good outcomes, though, right? Following norms sometimes is going to lead to less desirable outcomes. Like, if you are thinking about behaviors that we are trying to get people to stop doing, like let's say engaging in unsafe sex or dangerous drug use or underage drinking or something, if you are talking about those things and telling people the rates of them, it's possible that they have underestimated those rates. And if you tell them that others are doing it, it might promote the behavior. So public service announcements, for example, that are talking about alcohol consumption and where people are doing it, these things are communicated to tell people, basically, look, there are places where there's too much binge drinking, and it's supposed to be basically like, hey, if you're in kind of these states in the Midwest and the Rust Belt particularly, those are places where binge drinking is, a problem. Well, sometimes people are going to see that and not interpret it as, oh, that's a problem here, I should stop. Maybe more likely, they're going to say, the behavior I'm engaging in this place is normal. Everyone else is drinking too. Cool. Or people are going to say, people are, or they'll realize that people are drinking, and they might feel, wow, I live in the Midwest or the Rust Belt or the Northeast, and I'm not drinking. What's weird about me? I should drink more and binge drink. So these types of appeals can have sort of unintended consequences because they tell people a descriptive norm, and they then want to try to fit into it. So again, some things that are similar to this, like when you have to do some kind of alcohol training before you start at many colleges. I think, as far as I know, I believe I remember Tulane has something like this. I know the other schools I have taught at and ones I've gone to myself had things like this, where you're learning a lot about alcohol, hopefully before you get there, and they tell you the rates of people that binge drink or have alcohol poisoning or something. And if they're really high rates, then that is not indicating to you necessarily that it's a problem. It might be a signal to you that, like, wow, everybody drinks there. To fit in, I need to drink too, which is, not really the intended message. Kind of goes against what the program is supposed to be for, right? So why don't we, to kind of wrap up a little bit talking about social norms, instead of ending on that one, let's end on one that's not necessarily better, but one that is kind of a little mixed bag here, because you can have these types of comparisons that might work for some people and not work for others too. So you might be familiar with these types of things that you get from your energy company that tell you something about your energy use with respect to how it compares to other people, basically. Sometimes putting actual information about your electric and gas consumption compared to others might be good to help drive your energy consumption down yourself. So imagine you get something like this that tells you, hey, look, here was your energy consumption. Here, your efficient neighbors, wow, you did even better than your most efficient neighbors, and you're way better than all your neighbors. You're doing great. So this appeal seems to be something that would be good and encourage people to keep saving energy. And maybe it does sometimes, but it's also very possible that this type of information might tell people, like, well, hey, I'm doing my part, maybe even a little too well. I don't need to save as much energy. Look at nobody else is doing as good as I am. I can use a little more energy next month, or not be so careful about turning things off, and things will be just fine. So if people get this type of communication and they have a high level of energy consumption, even further out here where they're more than the average neighbor, those people are going to decrease their consumption on average if they see that type of communication. But people that see this communication and show that they're using way less than other neighbors, those people in different studies have started using more. And you can imagine this thing or this going to other types of resources too, like water consumption or other like commonly, or not public, but other commonly used goods that people are consuming. So it's important to remember your messaging should not be the same for all people. Social norms are going to affect different people in different ways, and it's important to remember how those different effects might manifest. Even though these things, these social norms and these types of appeals obviously have big effects on us, sometimes we either don't notice them at all, or we like to think that we are very independent, agentic people that, don't go with the flow and don't really pay attention to what other people are doing. And some evidence of this, that towel study that I talked about, even when people did reuse their towels more, when they were asked by the researchers on a survey why they reused their towels, the people that were reusing them tended to say that they were using it for environmental purposes. But we know that that's not true, because the people that were getting the environmental appeal were less likely to do it. And the people in the condition where they were told that so many other guests were reusing their towels and then they reused them, those people were the ones saying that they did it for environmental reasons. Obviously, that's not true. So we often make up reasons for our behavior that might not really have anything to do with why we did them. But it's important to know that even if we don't always notice that they're doing it, social norms have a really big impacts on our behavior. And if we or especially in the circumstances where the is and the ought, or the descriptive and injunctive norms, are consistent with one another, and we are really aware of them, and they're pointed out to be relevant to us, then they're especially going to be impactful in driving our behavior. So just to wrap up, coming up relatively soon, you do have another writing assignment due on Friday, April 17th. And for that one, I want you to think a little bit about social norms and actually violate one yourself. So this one tends to be pretty fun for people to do and fun to read about. And all I want you to do really is identify a social norm, violate it, and reflect on that experience. And a couple other questions like identifying what kind of norm it is as well. But just, think about these types of things. I do want to give some kind of guidelines, though. Don't pick a norm that is illegal. Don't get yourself or me in trouble by doing something stupid. So don't do anything that is illegal. Don't do anything. Generally, I give this instruction. I guess theoretically this still might be possible to disrupt something officially, even if you're not around here. Maybe more useful for our current situation. Please do not violate any type of norm related to illness or cleanliness. Don't violate any norms like getting too close to people or doing things that are not recommended health-wise. Don't do any of these types of things. I absolutely don't want to recommend those sorts of things. I don't expect anyone to probably do it, but here is me saying it out loud, so you really don't do it. But try to think about a type of social norm that in whatever current location or situation you're in, you could violate it and kind of just reflect on that experience. So let me know if you have any questions about that, and I will look forward to looking over those. And with that, I'll also wrap up the content for Exam 3 for Conformity and Obedience. Remember, there's only 3 chapters on this next test, and that test will be our first one in Canvas. So let me know if you have any questions about that, how that's supposed to function, but it should work just like any other quiz that you might have ever taken on Canvas. But yeah, keep me posted on how the experience goes. If there's anything I can change or improve about it, I want to hear from you. Remember, I'm only learning about how I can improve things to the extent that I'm hearing about them from all of you, so do let me know. All right.